Hello and welcome back to the Football Discussion. This is your host, Colby Cummings. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the analytics movement around the NFL that's been taking over. In 2019, the Baltimore Ravens constantly going for it on fourth down really got the discussion moving on where analytics are taking the NFL.
The analytics guys will tell you that I don't follow the analytics nearly enough. They'll tell you that I go by my gut way more than I go by the analytics, and I do.
That was Baltimore Ravens head coach John Harbaugh discussing his increased use of NFL analytics in his in-game decision-making. So today we're going to be kicking off a three-part segment called Playing Football on Spreadsheets, focused on the analytics movement around the NFL and what it can teach us. The first episode is going to talk about some of the myths debunked by using analytics. The second episode is going to talk about going for it on fourth down or going for two after scoring touchdowns. And the third episode is going to talk about how we should be measuring quarterback play around the NFL with more advanced metrics as opposed to the old, out-of-date metrics we have been using. So a little background on what analytics really mean. Analytics are just a way that we can understand the game from a different angle. A lot of times they're just adding context instead of just having raw stats that we've kind of used forever. So what it really does is it helps give us a better look at the game. In the NFL, analytics are really in their infant stages as compared to Major League Baseball, where it's more advanced, it's been used forever, it's more widely accepted. So this is what really sparks the debate between pro-analytics people and anti-analytics people, is that we don't really know how useful these analytics are yet because they've only been used for such a short period of time. NFL, it's obviously a shorter season, there's less data to be able to use to build all these mathematical models. But I think it's really important that I think coaches do start to add analytics into their decision making. You know, you look at any business, a Fortune 500 company, they're going to use artificial intelligence and analytics to help their companies run better. So I think it only makes sense for an NFL team to also adopt some of those similar principles. Ultimately, football is a very conservative sport, basically meaning that it's very slow to accept new ideas, and that's what these analytics are doing. They go against conventional wisdom. But I do think the analytics add more knowledge to the game, and I think knowledge is power, so I think it's really interesting to learn about, and I think it is definitely something that teams can benefit from. The entire premise of NFL analytics is that it tries to take past data that it has, put it into some kind of mathematical model, and control for certain variables, and then spit out a percentage of what can be expected to happen in the future. So what can analytics teach us about how to build a team, what to expect from an offensive line, how a quarterback play should be measured? What has it really taught us since it's been implemented and kind of been pushed more into the mainstream? The first myth I'd like to talk about is that the offensive line is the responsible party for when a quarterback is sacked, because clearly analytics really tell us that this is not true. The only way a quarterback can be sacked is if he's holding the ball and he's tackled, correct? So that must mean that the quarterback has something, if not a lot, to do with when they're sacked. The average time that a quarterback holds onto the ball before releasing it appears to be very constant over time. Season over season, guys who hold the ball too long, they've always done it in the past, they're currently doing it, and they should be expected to do it in the future. And that's one of the main reasons that they're going to take more sacks. It's not always the offensive line getting beat. A more accurate way to measure an offensive line's ability to pass block would be pass block win rate, which has been developed by ESPN. It really measures how long the offensive line is giving the quarterback to throw. It measures success rates. So if an offensive line is able to hold for 2.5 seconds, that means that they're successful. So they're not penalized when a quarterback holds the ball for 3.5 seconds, doesn't get it out like they should, and they take a sack. That's going to become more on the quarterback's fault for allowing the sack. Football is obviously a team sport. One hand washes the other. So it's not completely on offensive lines and it's not completely on quarterbacks. But what analytics really teach us that it is more on quarterbacks than previously thought. So sacks truly are a quarterback stat. I know that goes against conventional wisdom, but the analytics have really dove deep into this and saw how much more quarterbacks have an influence over sacks versus offensive lines. So when measuring quarterback play, sacks obviously need to be taken into account. That is something I'll talk about in the third episode where we dive deeper into quarterback play and how we should be measuring it. Sticking with the topic of sacks, we're going to go ahead and dive into another myth that analytics help us debunk. Measuring a pass rusher by the number of sacks they have is actually a terrible idea. It really does not tell much of the story or any of the story, to be truthful. Sacks is just a number that's very easy to measure. It always pops up on the bottom line on ESPN, to cover how many times a quarterback was sacked or how many times a pass rusher got home. But it really doesn't tell you how well that pass rusher is performing. You could actually play awful and have 4 sacks. But if you have 4 sacks, people are going to say, oh, well, he had a great game. I mean, look how much he got after the quarterback. But that just measures those 4 plays. If you're playing 50 plays on defense and you have 4 sacks, and that's the only impact you made, you probably might not have had a good game at all. You might have been completely irrelevant for 95% of the plays. When playing defense, consistency is key, so we need to look for a stat that measures consistency. One that I really like would be pass rush win rate, also developed by ESPN. What pass rush win rate really allows us to do is it allows us to measure the number of times a defender is pressuring the quarterback, because analytics really tells us that pressuring the quarterback is a lot more effective than sacking the quarterback. While this seems a little counterintuitive, the logic behind this is that consistently pressuring a quarterback is going to lead to overall better defensive efficiency. It's going to help create turnovers, versus sacks are a little bit more infrequent. They're kind of random. A good defender is going to pressure a quarterback consistently. That means they're a good player, play in, play out. A sack, you can just get lucky on a certain play and record a sack. And that's not to say that good defenders don't get sacks. You think of Aaron Donald, J.J. Watt for years. Those are great players, and they also seem to get sacks too. What really separates the average players from the great players is how consistent they are. Sacks are something that's very infrequent and somewhat rare. Pressures is something that good defenders, they're going to do consistently. So measuring pressures is a better measure of how effective a pass rusher is at getting after the quarterback, creating turnovers, getting tackles for losses, things like that. The problem with sacks is that there's such a small sample size, it's just not fair to measure a player with such a small sample size. Pressures are obviously a lot more frequent, so good players are going to have a ton of pressures, versus a player who's great and a player who's not so great. They could have similar sack numbers. The next thing we'll cover that analytics has really taught us is using touchdown to interception ratio to measure quarterback play. Say a quarterback throws 500 passes in a season and has 25 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. So 30 throws were either a touchdown or interception out of 500 passes. That's only taking into account 6% of their passes. It makes absolutely no sense to measure anybody off of 6% of their plays, kind of like we just talked about with the sack argument. This is the same thing. It's not really fair to measure somebody off of such a small sample size of their output. Another issue is that passing touchdowns truly are a function of how often you're throwing near the goal line. That's not to say that your favorite quarterback with all these touchdowns isn't good, but it is something to say that in small sample sizes, when you're throwing near the goal line, you tend to just throw more touchdowns. That's pretty obvious. And interceptions are really just a function of a team trailing. When a team's behind, the defense is able to just drop back into coverage. They know what's coming. They're going to get more interceptions that way. That also seems pretty obvious. And I'm not going to come on here and defend Jameis Winston. If you throw 30 interceptions, I'm going to just write you off as a crappy quarterback. But just measuring interceptions alone isn't a very good measure. Again, we have the sample size problem. Another issue is that interceptions can easily be avoided by taking sacks, throwing the ball away, constantly checking down versus being more aggressive and driving the ball downfield. That's how you score points. But if you're looking to protect your interception numbers, you're going to do everything you can in your power to avoid them. But that ultimately might be hurting the team. So measuring quarterback play just by how many interceptions they are or are not throwing definitely is not a good measure. So touchdown to interception ratio, it's just not fair to measure only, 6 to maybe at most 10% of a person's throws to tell you how good they're playing. Another stat that the advanced analytics have kind of put to shame is the widely used passer rating to measure quarterback play. It's commonly thought as a catch-all stat for quarterback play. It just puts it all into one number and it's supposed to tell us how good a quarterback is performing. But there are a lot of problems with passer rating. Passer rating is a pretty complicated formula on how they calculate it, so I'm not going to go into the details too much with that. But there is a very large emphasis on touchdown to interception ratio, which we just talked about why that's not a very effective measure to measure quarterback play. Passer rating also does not include sacks, which we talked about earlier, why you need to include sacks as a part of measuring quarterback play. Fumbles and rushing yards are not calculated into passer rating, but those are definitely parts of a quarterback's overall play. Also, completion percentage is very highly valued and helps increase a person's pass rating. The analytics have really shown how completion percentage can easily be manipulated, obviously by checking down, taking easy completions. On a 3rd and 16, taking an easy completion for 10 yards and you're forced to punt, that's going to make your passer rating look better, but it's really not bringing you any closer to winning the game. So with a large emphasis on completion percentage when it's calculated into passer rating, really kind of shows us that passer rating is probably an outdated measure. So passer rating really isn't a catch-all stat for quarterback play, kind of like we've been used to seeing and like we've been led to believe. The last myth we'll talk about will drive Bill Parcells crazy, and the famous words of him, "You are what your record says you are," analytics would likely disagree. Using win-loss record to tell if a team is good or not really isn't a great measure according to the analytics. This is obviously going to be one that's not going to sit well with a lot of people. It obviously seems really counterintuitive, but what the analytics suggests is that your record is highly dependent on your performance in close games, and that performance in close games is often very random. This is something that we saw just last year with the Seattle Seahawks. They played in a lot of close games and were very fortunate in a lot of those close games to come out on top. The analytics argue that point differential is a much better measure of describing how well a team is playing and how good they actually are. So if you take every one-possession game from the Seahawks last year and switch the result, making wins losses and losses wins, Seattle goes from one of the top teams in the NFL to one of the worst teams in the NFL. And what the math and the analytics suggests is that Seattle is likely going to regress to the mean, basically meaning that they're going to have to come back to earth. So basically last year they exceeded expectations in close games. That means that in the future they should be expected to underperform those expectations in close games, and they will lose those games more often in the future, which is obviously going to bring them back to the mean. So a team that won 11 games despite playing so many close games, you would expect them to play a lot of close games in the future, but not be as lucky in those situations and likely be closer to a 6 or 7 win team, is what the math would suggest. So using point differential, we're able to see what a team's predicted record would be. And what the analytics say is that teams who exceeded their predicted record based on point differential by 2 to 3 games saw an average of a 2.5 win decrease the following season. So like I just mentioned, Seattle, a team that played so many close games, should be expected to underperform next year. Probably going to be looking at closer to like a 6 to 7 win season is what the analytics suggest. There are going to be a lot of people who really disagree with this theory. They are going to think that good teams play well in close games. That's what makes them good teams. But the math, it really doesn't support that at all. It really just shows us that performance in close games, it really is truly random. I find it really tough to argue with the math here. There is a lot of evidence that they use to support this. Obviously, it's not always going to be right. This is just based on mathematical models and averages. And I know that no NFL team likes to think that their team is average, but the truth is, over a long enough period of time, if you have a big enough sample size, teams do usually come back to earth. They find themselves right back around the average. On top of point differential, there are a couple other metrics that I really like, one of them being DVOA, or defense adjusted value over average. Basically, this is taking a team's performance and adjusting for the opponent. So if you perform really well against good teams, that's going to help you a lot. If you perform well against bad teams, it's going to help you, but not as much. Football Outsiders does a great job of ranking these teams in yards and points per game, and they adjust for the opponent that they've done this against. Another metric that I really like is 538's ELO rating. Again, this is a mathematical model that is opponent adjusted. So despite what Bill Parcells would say, I don't think win-loss record is a great way to measure a team, how good they actually are, because eventually you can run out of luck. This is what I really find interesting about the analytics, is it's able to take things that we've always known as fact and really add some context to them and show us how there are different ways to measure things. And that by adding context, we can really start to understand the game more, we can understand teams more, we can understand players better, and that just because we always thought something was true, that's not necessarily the case. Analytics really helps us see how outdated some measures are and how we have better measures nowadays that can help us better understand the game. I know how difficult it'll be for fans to really start embracing the analytics and really buy into what they're saying because it goes against their generally accepted outlook on the game. And I won't try and sell you that these analytics are perfect. They're definitely not. They're a work in progress. But I do think they are a step in the right direction for us to help understand the game even better going forward. So thank you for taking the time to listen today, where we got a chance to talk about some myths in the NFL that are currently being debunked by the analytics debate going on. Stay tuned for future episodes. We're going to talk about whether teams should be going for it on 4th down, if going for 2 is the right idea, and when it's the right idea. And then also in the 3rd episode, we're going to talk about quarterback play and better ways to measure that with a little bit more in-depth look at it. This is Colby Cummings from the Football Discussion. Thank you for listening today.